Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs. I'm the managing editor for Reminder Publishing, and this is a new edition of Government Matters. A very timely edition because our guest today is Congressman Richard Neal, the chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee. And if there is one guy I want to talk to about what's happening, it's this guy. Thanks very much for joining us, sir.
Glad to be here, Mike.
Okay, so I'm going to give you a big, wide shotgun question to begin with. What is happening that most Americans are not aware that's happening in Congress right now? Because our focus is so much on the election, I know there's stuff that's got to be going on. What's going on that people may not be aware of and have not been adequately reported?
Actually, you raise a really terrific question, but it relates not to this period of transition, but it relates to a bigger story that I think is important for the American people in terms of how they consume news. There's more attention than ever paid to the national narrative, the loud. There's far less attention paid to what I would call the inside business of actually making things happen. The idea that results are what we position ourselves for because it's legislation that changes lives. So I think that right now, leadership elections are underway. That's one example that comes to mind. I think there's a broad consensus that addressing the pandemic in a Biden administration is going to be priority number one. And I think number two, we link that to economic recovery. But how best to do that? So the argument that I've made to the administration, the new administration, as well as to Speaker Pelosi, is the following: that we should try to link the whole idea of stimulus, pandemic relief, and climate change simultaneously. I think that there's ample opportunity for people of temperament to understand the flow of legislation and how it really works. And addressing those three issues is important. The CARES Act that we passed early on that saved the American economy, we're going to have to do something similar to it again. The HEROES Act, which we passed in May, was at $3.4 trillion. It stalled in the U.S. Senate, where much legislation is stalled, largely because of the intransigence of Leader McConnell. But doing what we did in the CARES Act, once again, is going to be important. And Speaker Pelosi's position was pretty simple. We will compromise the figure of $3.4 trillion. We'll bring that to $2 trillion, but we'll shorten the duration, which would give President-elect Biden a chance after January 20th, when he will be inaugurated, to lay out his own plan. But in the interim period, for the next 5.5 weeks, we're going to need another round of pandemic relief, separate from what I think we're likely to do once the President-elect takes the oath.
In terms of communication, and I agree, people are hurting, and they're looking toward the government for some additional relief. But in terms of communication, is there the communication still established between individuals such as yourself and the Secretary of Treasury, for instance? Are people still talking? Do they still recognize the urgency that we're facing in terms of pandemic relief?
Well, I think that the point you raise is everybody's talking. It's just what voices we can rely on.
Okay.
And I think there's a distinction that needs to be drawn there. I have spoken with Secretary Mnuchin regularly. We were in almost weekly contact for a period of about 3.5 years, and we went back and forth. I think that a reminder that Speaker Pelosi, myself, and Secretary Mnuchin, early on in the CARES Act, we negotiated that legislation on a Friday night over the phone, myself and the Speaker in her office with the Ways and Means staff, and Secretary Mnuchin on the other end of the line. The conversations went back and forth for a long period of time, 5 hours. He said, let me call you back. We would say, well, we'll call you back. But we found the negotiating path and we drew some parameters. So the conversations continue. I think there's a bit of a lull now at the White House. I think as the president continues to focus on the legitimacy of the election, which I think is a terrible miscalculation on his part. There is no evidence of widespread fraud. And at most you're going to do is turn around a few hundred votes, which, by the way, could go to Biden as well as to Trump. And I think the election's been settled. And I think the closer that we get to inaugural day, we'd all be better off if the president would simply say, let's address the pandemic in this short period of time. Let's talk about maybe a short-term stimulus package, and then congratulate Joe Biden and allow the next president of the United States, the 46th president, to make a determination.
I know that you are definitely a student of American history.
Oh.
In the 20th century, and I was racking my brain on this, in the 20th century, did we have a presidential election that was so contested?
Well, Richard Nixon graciously accepted the result of the election in 1960. And while his most ferocious partisans encouraged him to seek a recount, particularly in the state of Illinois, in Cook County, he thought that would not be helpful to America. I remember in my own household the excitement we felt about Jack Kennedy's election, but waking that morning after going to bed not knowing really what had happened. And you talk about interesting juxtaposition, Nixon won California, but Kennedy won Texas. And when the election was called, Richard Nixon stepped to the microphone and said, I have sent the following telegram, which he read, to President-elect Kennedy. He accepted the result at the Armory in Hyannis. Jack Kennedy traveled there to accept the telegram. It was done in a manner, I think, of high-mindedness. And then even with Al Gore, whom you know I vigorously supported in the election against George W. Bush, that was never a question in Florida about fraud. It was a question about how the votes were being tabulated.
Right.
The dangling chads, that was the kind of the famous metaphor. So what President Trump has attempted to do here is to draft this sort of argument that there's been an illegitimate victory for Joe Biden. There's no evidence to support that. I also think that the gracious manner in which John McCain conceded to Barack Obama, in which he actually, if you recall, shouted down a couple of people in the audience who questioned the victory and pointed out to them that Barack Obama was going to be the next president, and this was a historic moment. So I think that we're all better off. There is no constitutional requirement for the concession speech, but it goes a long way toward establishing credibility for the successor. And I thought in the case of Al Gore in 2000, the manner in which he accepted defeat, even though it had been a 5-4 decision in the Supreme Court. Hillary Clinton waited until the next day, that's all. She was up by 3 million votes.
Right.
She waited until simply the next day and informed the president-elect of her concession. So I think that we're not well served in a period where both sides are so charged up, and coupled with the fact that there's so much misinformation circulated about the election result. You're not going to turn around 50,000 votes in Pennsylvania. You're not going to turn around the vote totals in Wisconsin. And in Arizona and Georgia, which were pleasant surprises for Democrats, still unlikely, even in Georgia, that you're going to turn around 14,000 votes.
I know a lot of focus is on Georgia because of its Senate race and because we're not going to find out for quite some time about how that's going to shake down. And there's concern about whether or not the status quo in the Senate is going to be maintained in terms of the power, or if the Democrats are going to be able to assume leadership through a very slight margin. What's your feelings about the House and the results in this election? And I'm trying to remember the last thing. If you're a news junkie, unfortunately, you can get an overload at this time. But have all the House seats been settled at this issue?
No, there are still 14 seats to be determined. I never bought into the idea that we were going to win 15 or 20 seats, but I never bought into the idea that we could lose 6 or 7 either.
Okay.
I thought we were more closely aligned with a 7 to 10 pickup. Again, how bad was the polling in this election? So I think that of those races that are still to be called, most of them are concentrated in California. There's still a couple in New York, which I think will play out our way. But I do think that the net loss now for Democrats with those 14 seats to go could be between 5 and 8. We have already established a majority. The official count is at 218 to 203. So there will not be any change in the ratios on the committee, which, as you might expect, I would have looked very hard to keep an eye on what the ratios are, because you need a governing majority on your committee. And I think on the Democratic side, there's going to be some soul searching about the polling and whether or not some of the investments should have been made in some races. There's a certain callousness and cruelty that comes along in about the last month of a campaign for House seats. And that is the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. They will usually poll the races throughout, but then it's a Machiavellian moment. And you can imagine how painful it is when the head of the Congressional Campaign Committee calls the Democratic candidate, or on the other side, they do the same thing. They call their candidate and they say, we are no longer going to help to fund your campaign and or to organize your campaign. We see no path to victory, so we're going to use those resources someplace else. And it's very hard because the candidate has to then tell the most fervent supporters that the DCCC or the Republican Congressional Campaign Committee, they've pulled the resources they're pulling out of the race. So you have an idea, probably in the last 2 weeks, of what's for real. And there's another part of it that a lot of people don't pay attention to, and that is that how few seats are really now competitive in the House of Representatives? Maybe 60 in this cycle. And there was a time when you could have looked at maybe 200 seats that were competitive. That's no longer the case. I think part of it is not just demographics, but where we all live now. We tend to live in very blue areas or very red areas. The number of people that were undecided in the presidential election was astoundingly low. I think that you could have gotten a high school student to pick the top 40 states, and we were down to those 10. But I also think that on the Democratic side, there's some angst about the polling, because polling's expensive. And most groups pull out if they think there's no chance that the candidate can win. A couple that come to mind for me, the Kelly-McSally race in Arizona, that looked as though Kelly was supposed to have a big lead, according to all polling. Kelly won by 3 points. Biden had, according to the Washington Post ABC poll, a 17-point lead in Wisconsin. He won by less than 1. If you read any publication in New England for 2 months, you knew Susan Collins had no chance of getting reelected because of the polling. She won by 9. So I think that there should be less attention paid to the news story of polling and more attention paid to the methodology of polling. In my own instance, I've used the same pollster for 5 elections. I can tell you this, in each instance he has called it right on the number. And he's done that almost a year before.
Wow.
Pretty remarkable.
Well, so much of technology has changed, which has affected the polling methodology. You know, it used to be you just call somebody up, you get your representative sampling. Now with cell phones, it's much more difficult to get a hold of people.
Well, the sampling is also distorted by the methodology, and that is that, for example, trying to get young people using caller ID to cooperate in a poll is pretty hard. About 6% of the respondents now pay attention to polling, and that means you've got to continue to look for a bigger and broader sample. And this is where I think we get into trouble with the polling. You have to, if you can't get enough people to participate in the poll, you have to do a statistical adjustment. And that's been way off. So, for example, if you don't get enough working white class voters without a college degree to participate, then you have to model a statistic. If you don't get enough African Americans to participate in the poll, you model the statistic. The adjustment you make is of profound consequence, particularly when it's wrong. And in 2016, it was, the popular vote in 2016, oddly enough, was correct. The electoral college vote in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin was off. And in this instance here, even though Biden won those 3 states, the polling was still off.
I took a look at some of the presidential results here in Western Massachusetts, and I admit I was sort of surprised. 25.5% of voters in Berkshire County voted for President Trump, 25.6 in Hampshire County voted for President Trump, 26.6 in Franklin County voted for President Trump. That's pretty consistent. But then if we look at Hampden County, it's 40.3% voted for President Trump. So there's clearly a fair number of people in the largest county in Western Massachusetts who back the president. What do we need to do to try to find common ground to solve problems with people who clearly their political views are not the same as other folks? I mean, how do we come together at this point?
Well, I think that the discourse that permeates the political conversation in America today is hypercharged. That's part of the problem. But also I think that, as you've described, the accuracy of the final numbers is a reminder here that 4 years ago, Donald Trump won East Long Meadow. He won Wilbraham. He won Agawam. He won Southwick. He won Wilbraham. He won Hampden. This time around, with I think the exceptions of Southwick and Agawam, Joe Biden won. And the point that I like to make with the pundits, who, by the way, have never won an election, they're only too happy to hold forth on electioneering. Nobody ever asks them, did you win an election? Is that in Springfield, you'd be hard-pressed to find a Republican. Charlie Baker won it by 2,600 votes. The last time a Republican gubernatorial candidate won Springfield was Frank Hatch against Ed King.
That goes back a few years.
That goes back a few years. So these voting patterns are kind of locked in over a long period of time. Hampden County is not Middlesex County. Hampden County is not Franklin County, nor is it Hampshire County. There's a different subset of voters that live in Hampden County. They tend to be moderates, overwhelmingly, on both sides. Now, there is a hard left and a hard right, but not nearly reflected as you would find in numbers in other parts of the state. And I think that part of the national conversation now ought to be directed at people who are interested in governing. As I noted earlier, it's legislation that changes lives. I mean, you can, because of social media, you can trigger a demonstration in a matter of minutes. But the broader consequence is, how do we shape legislation that is beneficial for all members of the American family? So you raise a really good point. And I think that it's, again, it's an underreported part of the electorate's results.
I must admit, I'm very concerned about the division in our country. And I don't think we've been this divided literally since the Civil War. And I'm hoping that we're able to come together to solve some of these problems, whether it's the pandemic or the economic situation or climate change, plenty of other issues that we need to address. I'm hoping that we can come together to get the consensus necessary to solve issues.
When President Lincoln took the oath of office in 1865 for the second time, and remember, the first time around he only got 39% of the vote. But when he took the oath of office the second time, after he had defeated George McClellan, who had been his top general, Lincoln looked out at a nation where 2% of the population had died, almost 700,000 people, wounds that in some instances are still there today. And he said, with malice toward none and charity for all. So I think that the words of a president go a long way toward national healing. And let me say that Joe Biden and I share a commonality, a respect for the institutions of governance. I understand clearly the rhythms of governing. But I also note that reassurance is what we need to offer to the American people. We're up to the task. We know how to do it. We know how to place amendments. We know how to get big legislation done. And Joe Biden, I think, is going to have one great advantage after he takes the oath. More than any president since Lyndon Johnson, who we would all say was a much accomplished president, more than any president since LBJ, Joe Biden is going to have the institutional ear of the United States Senate. Now, that's not to suggest this is a panacea, because it's not, and times have changed. The Republican Party and the base has moved considerably to the right. Democrats, at least nominally, have moved more to the left. But Biden is going to understand the rhythm of the Senate. And I think Speaker Pelosi is going to be able to deliver the numbers that we need in the House. But Biden should use the model of FDR and the reassurance he offered in the midst of the Depression, and remind everybody that the great act of the Roosevelt years included Social Security. And Lyndon Johnson in 1965 used an amendment to the Social Security Act, which he signed in Harry Truman's living room, called Medicare.
Right.
I mean, those are transformative moments. And Lyndon Johnson also used his majority, which was clearly substantially more than Joe Biden's going to have. But Lyndon Johnson used his majority, knowing that in 4 years he was unlikely to be as popular as he was in '68 as opposed to '64. We passed perhaps the most important piece of legislation socially in American history as well, called the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They're transformative. So I think that the healing that Johnson proposed, which didn't last a long time, and the reassurance that Joe Biden's candidacy proposed. I mean, Joe Biden's ascent to the White House is astounding. I mean, if you looked at the crowds in Iowa, I don't think you could even use plural. I mean, it was pretty, as we say in the business, brisk. But after South Carolina, the game was over.
Right.
Texas, he didn't use any investment, won easily. Massachusetts, he won easily. He barnstormed across the country without spending a lot of money, which he didn't have. But all of a sudden, on the Democratic side, moderate voters said he can win. And left voters said, we're hostile to Trump. We're going to vote for Biden. So I think that Biden's got a year to get some big things done before we move to the congressional midterms. But I think that what he brings is an element of patience with the Senate. And we need to continue to shore up the Affordable Care Act. We need to address climate change. There are, with infrastructure legislation, these are things we can do. And we need to get them done in the first few months. So I've pushed hard for those eventualities.
Okay, so you're the guy to talk to about taxes.
Right.
What do we've got coming up that the American people need to understand? Because I know that there was the famous Trump tax cut, which I'm not sure, being a pundit for a moment, folks, I'm not sure if it really has helped the number of Americans that at least it was sold to that was going to help. But what's coming up that people need to know there? The other thing I need to have clarification on was that payroll tax
Right.
co-op. You could get out of it, but is it my understanding that people still will have to pay?
Yes, they will.
So it's sort of kicking the can down the road a little bit about the amount of money that was taken out of your paycheck.
Yeah, what the Ways and Means Committee is looking at now is the possibility of letting people pay it back over a longer period of time so there's not a thud. I oppose the Trump tax cuts. I thought they were certainly overweighted in favor of people at the top, and they were. People in the middle and at the lower end of the economic scale didn't get a lot of tax relief. So in terms of priorities for me, given the fact that McConnell's going to run the Senate, I think that we ought to be considering expanding the earned income tax credit to single filers. I think that that is tax relief for people at the lower end of the economic scale. I don't think there's any Democrat that's talking about raising taxes on people under $400,000 a year, joint filers. So I think that we're likely, because of the Republican Senate and the Democratic House, to have a bit of a stalemate on tax policy. But there are some regulatory things that Vice President Kamala Harris and President Biden can undertake. And we're all waiting to see who the Secretary of the Treasury is going to be. So there's some things that you can do.
There seems to be an interesting bunch of stories out about Senator Warren being Secretary of the Treasury.
The name has been posited. I don't know whether or not she's indicated an earnest interest. I don't think there's any available evidence that there's been an all-out push for that. But I certainly think that it's important to remember, I think, that one thing she was really right about in the aftermath of 2008 was what happened on Wall Street. There's no excuse for what happened on Wall Street. And sometimes I think maybe the governing position of chastising those who certainly were responsible for the economic downturn, that's a skill set, and whether or not she winds up in the Biden cabinet, we're just going to have to wait and see.
Well, it's going to be interesting speculation between now and then, obviously. In terms of this transition period, you talked about what the House could do, should do. Generally, do you find, since you have lived through a number of these lame duck periods, is it a positive time in terms of legislative activities, or do you find sometimes that the lame duck period is not very much gets done?
It depends on the personalities and the policies. So I think you can do something in this lame duck. A lame duck session, as you know, it's important in the sense that the election's over. The tensions have evaporated. So you can actually get on to policy, and we're going to have to do something about extending unemployment insurance. But we have no choice. I mean, of the 23 million jobs that were lost, about 11 million have been recovered. But there's still an awful lot of people out there that are hurting, and they're going to need that relief. I think that the supplement that we included worked wonders. Remember, our job here was not just to create liquidity, it was also simultaneously to create demand. And if people in the middle and lower end of the economic scale, if they had that $1,200 check or they were collecting unemployment insurance, they were spending it.
Right.
That was really important. And we were able to, by the way, use electronic medium for getting that money into the hands of people who needed it immediately. It was really that $600 supplement. I think that we could find some agreement there. Secretary Mnuchin urged $400, and Speaker Pelosi was at $600. Strikes me that there's room here for an agreement.
Right. Well, I also have to ask you, because you're a great observer of government, was there any surprise to you in this presidential election? Was there any moment where you went, huh? Or did it play out in a way that you thought it was going to play out?
Yes and no. Yes, I always thought Biden would win. No, I didn't think that Trump would get 71 million votes. And I think that some of the polling was wrong. I think there is such a thing as a shy Trump voter out there who is reluctant to say on the phone that they were going to vote for him during a polling experience. And the other part of it, I think that we need to settle in on and be realistic about. I think Trumpism is not going to diminish. It's not going to go away. I think that many of those eruptions that we witnessed, the chaos that we witnessed, that there's an audience for it. And I think the misinformation, the fallacies, the falsehoods that were stated time and again, I think that given the age of social media, those of us, and I include you in that because I think that you're what I would consider to be a pretty dependable reporter.
Thank you.
No, but I think you're fact-based.
Right.
And I don't think anybody's going to throw you a curveball. But you, I suspect, would be the first, as you observe social media, to say there are fewer of you every year.
Unfortunately, there's been a great erosion of what journalism is, and it has slid down the hill to punditry. And
exactly.
People don't seem to understand that someone expressing opinion, even if they have some facts to base that opinion, it's still an opinion.
That's right.
And unfortunately for me, just watching as an observer of this election, punditry was ruling, not necessarily journalists.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I would say, and I think that it's a generational issue, but I think you'd perhaps be in agreement with me, you're the referee. If mainstream media doesn't get it right, how is it possible in a representative democracy for everybody else to get it right?
Right.
And I'm not big on watching the cable shows, to be frank, largely because I think there's always a mission statement that's built in. Mm-hmm. I think there's an entertainment value that is not helpful to political dialogue and debate. I always thought that, I use a couple of examples. I mean, I think get people like Dan Balls at the Washington Post. He's pretty good. I think Peter Baker at the Times is pretty good. I think locally you still have some pretty decent reporters. But I also think that they pay attention too frequently to social media. To see, they try to figure out if there's this new trim line that's out there, if there's this new story that they're missing, and then the bots and others take over and they know how to fill the void. But I think that good reporters are invaluable. As Mr. Jefferson observed centuries ago, they're the gatekeepers.
Well, I'll end on that high note for me. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks,
Really
Mike. Great to
appreciate
be
it.
with you.
And folks, thanks for watching Government Matters here on Focus Springfield.